Welcome back, adventurers. Tonight, we journey into the dark and mysterious world of The Witcher, where shadows linger and secrets hide beneath the surface. So, settle in, get comfortable, and let the soothing story carry you away to the land of dreams. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below telling us what you thought of the story. Sweet dreams. The air hung heavy, thick with the cloying scent of damp earth and the subtle metallic tang of the Pontar River. A perpetual haze, spun from river mist and the breath of the surrounding bogs, clung to the village of Oakhaven like a shroud. The sun, a pale, watery disk, struggled to pierce the veil, casting the thatched roofs and rough-hewn timber walls in a perpetual twilight. Here, nestled deep within the emerald embrace of the Pontar Delta, life was a slow, rhythmic dance between man and nature, a dance that had grown increasingly uneasy of late. Gavril, a man woven from the same muted hues as his surroundings, moved through the village with the quiet grace of a heron wading through reeds. His late 20s were etched onto his face, not in harsh lines, but in a subtle weathering, like the gentle wear on a well-loved tapestry. His eyes, the color of moss after a spring rain, held a depth that hinted at knowledge gleaned not from books, but from the whispers of the wind through the ancient willows and the rustling secrets of the marsh. He was a weaver by trade, his calloused fingers coaxing life into threads of wool and flax, creating tapestries that mirrored the vibrant, untamed beauty of the Delta. But his hands held another, more subtle skill. Those hands which brought beauty to life were also a scholar of the dark arts. His loom, a behemoth of oak and iron, dominated his small, cluttered hut. Skeins of yarn, dyed in a riot of colors extracted from local flora, hung like vibrant garlands, their scents mingling with the earthy aroma of dried herbs that dangled from the rafters. This was his sanctuary, a haven from the suspicious glares and hushed whispers that followed him through the village. They called him touched, a euphemism for something far less kind. They saw his knowledge of the old ways, the lore passed down from his eccentric grandmother, as something unnatural, something to be feared. Sunlight, fractured by the dusty window panes, illuminated a half-finished tapestry. It depicted a hunting scene, not of men and hounds, but of the marsh itself. A great egret, its plumage rendered in painstaking detail, stalked a plump, unsuspecting frog amidst a tangle of reeds. The scene pulsed with a realism that bordered on the uncanny, a testament to Gavril's intimate understanding of the natural world, an understanding that extended beyond the purely physical. A low, guttural moan echoed from outside, followed by the frantic clucking of chickens. Gavril paused, his hand hovering over a spool of crimson thread. His keen ears, attuned to the subtle symphony of the marsh, detected an undercurrent of unease in the familiar sounds. The moan came again, this time tinged with a desperate edge. It was the sound of Old Man Hemlock's prized milk cow, a beast as integral to the village's meager sustenance as the river itself. He stepped outside, into the swirling mist. The village was beginning to stir, the usual morning bustle tinged with a growing anxiety. A small group had gathered near Hemlock's enclosure, their faces pale and drawn in the dim light. Their voices, normally a comforting chorus of morning greetings and neighborly banter, were now laced with fear. "Gone," Hemlock was saying, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "Vanished. Just like that." Gavril approached, his gaze sweeping over the scene. The enclosure, a ramshackle affair of woven branches, stood empty. The only sign of the missing cow was a patch of disturbed earth, oddly devoid of any clear tracks. It was as if the creature had simply dissolved into the mist, leaving behind only a chilling silence. The air, usually alive with the chirping of insects and the croaking of frogs, felt strangely still, as if the very marsh itself held its breath. A shiver, colder than the morning air, traced its way down Gavril's spine. This was no ordinary wolf attack, no simple act of a wild animal. There was a wrongness to it, a subtle dissonance that resonated with the ancient warnings whispered in his grandmother's tales. The villagers, their faces etched with worry, exchanged uneasy glances. They were a practical folk, their lives dictated by the rhythms of the seasons and the harsh realities of survival. But even they, with their feet planted firmly in the mud of the delta, could sense that something was amiss. The whispers started, low and sibilant, like the rustling of leaves in a gathering storm. Something old, something dark, was stirring in the heart of the Pontar, and its shadow had fallen upon Oakhaven. The fog seemed to press in closer, a tangible manifestation of their growing fear, and the faint, sweet scent of decay, like overripe fruit, began to mingle with the familiar aromas of the marsh. Something wicked this way comes. The disappearances had begun subtly, almost imperceptibly. A prized hen vanished from a seemingly secure coop, leaving behind only a scattering of feathers and an unsettling silence. Then, a goat, known for its stubborn refusal to stray from the herd, was found missing from its tether, the rope frayed as if gnawed through, but with an unnatural neatness, a precision that belied the work of any known predator. The villagers, a pragmatic folk accustomed to the occasional loss to wolves or foxes, initially dismissed these incidents as isolated occurrences, the unfortunate toll of life on the edge of the untamed wilderness. But the disappearances continued, each one chipping away at the village's fragile sense of security. A hunting dog, renowned for its keen senses and unwavering loyalty, failed to return from its evening patrol, its absence a gaping hole in the familiar rhythm of village life. The incidents were marked by a strange, unsettling consistency. There were no signs of struggle, no blood trails, no lingering scent of predator. The animals simply vanished, as if swallowed whole by the encroaching fog that clung to the edges of the village like a living entity. Gavril, with his unsettling knowledge of ancient bestiaries and his uncanny ability to read the subtle language of the wild, observed these events with a growing sense of dread. He noticed the unnatural stillness that followed each disappearance, the way the very air seemed to hold its breath, as if the marsh itself was complicit in some dark, unspoken secret. He saw the subtle disturbances in the flora, the unusual wilting of plants, the faint, almost imperceptible trails that seemed to lead nowhere, yet pulsed with a strange, residual energy. These were not the markings of any natural predator he knew. His attempts to share his observations with the villagers were met with a mixture of skepticism and outright dismissal. "Old wives' tales," they muttered, their eyes darting nervously towards the swirling mist that seemed to press in closer with each passing day. "Gavril sees shadows where there are none," others whispered, their voices laced with a mixture of fear and derision. He was, after all, the outsider, the one touched by the unnatural, his knowledge a source of unease rather than comfort. One crisp morning, a morning when the fog hung heavier than usual, a collective gasp rippled through the village, shattering the uneasy quiet. It was not just an animal that was missing this time. Elara, a young woman known for her vibrant spirit and her skill in tending the village's meager herb garden, had vanished. She had gone out at dawn to collect dew-kissed petals of a rare moonflower, a blossom that bloomed only under the pale light of the waning moon, and had simply not returned. The discovery of her empty basket, lying abandoned near the edge of the whispering reeds, a particularly dense and foreboding section of the marsh, sent a shockwave of terror through Oakhaven. The basket, woven from willow branches and adorned with Elara's signature blue ribbon, lay on its side, a few scattered moonflower petals clinging to its rim like pale, ghostly tears. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints, no indication of which direction she might have taken. It was as if the fog had simply reached out and plucked her from their midst, leaving behind only a chilling void. This was no longer a matter of livestock or hunting dogs. This was a threat to the very heart of their community. The whispers of fear that had been circulating for weeks now erupted into open panic. The villagers huddled together, their faces pale and drawn in the dim light, their eyes wide with a terror that transcended the everyday hardships of their lives. The unseen predator, once a distant threat lurking at the edges of their perception, had now stepped into the light, its presence undeniable, its intentions terrifyingly clear. It was no longer just taking their animals, but taking them, too. The gentle hum of village life was replaced by a silence, heavy and thick with a new kind of fear. The disappearance of Elara hung over Oakhaven like a shroud, a constant, chilling reminder of the unseen terror that lurked just beyond the flickering circle of firelight. The attacks, once sporadic and unsettling, now escalated with a terrifying frequency. It seemed as though the creature, emboldened by its success, was growing bolder, its hunger insatiable. Sheep vanished from their pens in the dead of night, their woolly coats the only evidence left behind, scattered like macabre confetti. Fishing nets, laid out to dry along the riverbank, were found empty in the morning, the carefully woven twine slashed with an unnatural precision. The air, once filled with the comforting sounds of livestock and the rhythmic creak of the fishing boats, was now thick with a silence broken only by the nervous whispers of the villagers. Whispers of a gloom shroud began to circulate, a name born from the chilling fog that heralded each attack and the creature's shadowy, indistinct form. The villagers spoke of a creature of nightmare, a being that moved like smoke, its eyes burning with a cold, malevolent light. Fear, a primal, instinctual terror, took root in the heart of Oakhaven, its tendrils snaking through the once close-knit community, twisting their everyday interactions into a tense dance of suspicion and dread. The traditional methods of protection, passed down through generations, proved utterly useless against this new, insidious threat. Wards of rowan and wolfsbane, meticulously placed above doorways and windows, did nothing to deter the creature. Bonfires, usually effective in keeping wild animals at bay, seemed only to draw the gloom shroud closer, the flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on the eye, making it impossible to distinguish between the real and the imagined. The hunting dogs, once fearless and eager to protect their masters, now whimpered and cowered, their tails tucked between their legs, their keen senses overwhelmed by a presence they could neither see nor understand. Elder Rowan, his face etched with worry, his usually steady voice trembling with a hint of fear, called a village meeting. The villagers gathered in the central square, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of torches, their eyes darting nervously towards the encroaching darkness. The once familiar space, usually a hub of laughter and community, now felt like a fragile island in a sea of unseen terror. The mood was heavy, silent, save for the crackle of fire and the occasional sob. "We must face this," Rowan declared, his voice ringing with a desperate attempt at authority. "This gloom shroud. It is unlike anything we have encountered before.
Our old ways are failing us."
A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mixture of agreement and despair. The suggestion, unthinkable just weeks ago, began to gain traction. "A witcher," someone whispered, the word carrying a mixture of hope and trepidation.
"We need a witcher!"
The word hung in the air, a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. Witchers, with their mutated abilities and their knowledge of the dark arts, were the only ones equipped to deal with such unnatural threats. But the cost. The cost was a heavy burden for a small, impoverished village like Oakhaven. Witchers did not work for free, their services demanding a price that often stretched a community's resources to the breaking point. Beyond the financial burden, there was a deep-seated distrust of outsiders, a prejudice ingrained in the villagers' psyche through generations of isolation. Witchers, with their strange eyes and their unsettling aura of power, were often viewed with suspicion, their methods deemed as unnatural as the creatures they hunted. To invite one into their midst would be to invite the unknown, to potentially expose themselves to a different kind of danger. The cost was monetary, yes, but also to their pride. "We are a proud people," declared a burly fisherman, his voice thick with defiance.
"We have always dealt with our own problems."
"We do not need outsiders." A chorus of agreement rose from some corners of the crowd, but it was quickly countered by a wave of dissent. "Our children are disappearing," a woman cried, her voice raw with grief. "Our livelihoods are being destroyed. We cannot afford pride when our very survival is at stake." The village was divided, split between their fear of the gloom shroud and their fear of the unknown, their desperation for help warring with their ingrained prejudices. The meeting dissolved into chaos, the once unified community fractured by fear and uncertainty. The gloom shroud, unseen but ever present, continued its reign of terror, its presence a constant, chilling reminder of their vulnerability. The darkness seemed to press in closer, the fog a tangible manifestation of their fear, and the faint, sweet scent of decay, like a whispered threat, lingered in the air long after the last villager had retreated into the uncertain safety of their home. The village was trapped, held hostage by an invisible enemy and their own internal demons, their hope for salvation dwindling with each passing day. They were losing, and the chilling realization settled upon them like the very fog that defined their new enemy. A chilling premonition, perhaps, of what was to come. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple. The ever-present fog seemed to thicken with the fading light, transforming familiar shapes into menacing phantoms. A chilling stillness descended upon Oakhaven, broken only by the crackling of the watchfires and the nervous murmurs of the villagers huddled within their homes. Fear, thick and suffocating, hung in the air, a palpable entity. 10-year-old Finn, a boy known for his boundless energy and his mischievous spirit, chafed under the enforced confinement. He was used to roaming freely, exploring the edges of the village, his pockets filled with smooth stones and other treasures gleaned from the marsh. The recent events, the disappearances, the growing fear, were a cage he could not abide by. He felt like a wild animal, trapped and restless. He longed for the open air, for the thrill of discovery, even if that thrill was tinged with a hint of danger. Driven by a childish defiance and a yearning for normalcy, Finn slipped away from his family's hut while his mother's back was turned. He darted through the shadows, his small form swallowed by the gathering gloom. He headed towards the whispering reeds, drawn by an irresistible urge to test the boundaries of the unseen threat, to prove to himself that the monster was not as powerful as the adults claimed. It was a childish rebellion, perhaps, but it was a mistake that would change everything. The fog was particularly dense near the reeds, a swirling, opaque mass that muffled sound and distorted vision. Finn, emboldened by a surge of adrenaline, pushed his way through the thick vegetation, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the rustling of the reeds, the gentle lapping of the water, the distant croaking of frogs. But beneath these familiar sounds, he detected another, more subtle sound, a soft, slithering sound, like something heavy being dragged through the mud. It was faint, but close. Very close. Suddenly, the air grew heavy, the sweet scent of decay overwhelming his senses. The fog seemed to press in on him, suffocating him, stealing his breath. He felt a presence, cold and malevolent, lurking just beyond his vision. Terror, sharp and icy, pierced through his bravado, turning his legs to jelly. He tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat, a choked whimper lost in the swirling mist. He was not alone. He could feel it. Then, out of the fog, a shape began to coalesce. It was not the towering beast of village legend, but something far more insidious. A shadowy form, vaguely humanoid, but shifting and indistinct, its edges blurred and indistinct. Its eyes, 2 points of malevolent green light, burned through the gloom, fixing on Finn with a predatory intensity. The shape lunged, moving with an unnatural speed, its shadowy limbs extending towards the terrified boy. It was upon him before he could even blink. A desperate cry, ripped from Finn's throat, finally broke through his fear. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror, a sound that carried on the wind, piercing the oppressive silence of the village. It was a sound no parent could ignore. The cry galvanized the villagers into action. Torches flared to life, casting long, dancing shadows that battled with the encroaching fog. Armed with whatever they could grab, axes, pitchforks, fishing spears, they rushed towards the sound, their fear momentarily overridden by a surge of desperate courage. They had to save him. They found Finn on the edge of the whispering reeds, sprawled on the ground, his eyes wide with terror, his body trembling uncontrollably. The shadowy form was gone, vanished back into the fog, leaving behind only the lingering scent of decay and the chilling echo of Finn's terrified screams. The boy was alive, but the experience had left him deeply scarred, forever altering his perception of the world.
The attack on Finn was a turning point.
It was a brutal confirmation that the Gloom Shroud was not merely a predator of livestock, a threat to their livelihoods. It was a hunter of men, a creature that preyed on the very heart of their community. The attack was distinctly different, more brazen, more aggressive than anything they had witnessed before. It was clear that the creature was evolving, its methods growing more cunning, its hunger more insatiable. It was no longer content with the easy prey of their animals. It was coming for them. The chilling realization settled upon them like a shroud. The calls for a witcher, once a murmur of dissent, now rose to a desperate chorus. The villagers, their fear amplified by the near tragedy, finally acknowledged that they were outmatched, that their traditional methods were useless against this unnatural threat. They needed help, specialized help, even if it meant swallowing their pride and incurring a debt they could scarcely afford. The reality of it all was setting in. They were outmatched. However, a new obstacle presented itself, a cruel twist of fate. Messengers, dispatched to the nearest settlements known to harbor witchers, returned with grim news. The nearest witcher was days away, engaged in a contract far to the north. Other witchers, even if they could be reached, were similarly occupied, scattered across the vast and dangerous landscape, battling their own demons. The price was too high. The distance was too far. They were on their own. Oakhaven was isolated, cut off from help, surrounded by a creature that grew stronger with each passing day. The villagers were trapped, caught between their fear of the Gloom Shroud and the harsh reality of their limited resources, their hope for salvation dwindling with each tick of the clock. The weight of their predicament settled upon them, heavy and suffocating, as the fog continued to swirl around their beleaguered village, a constant, chilling reminder of the predator that lurked just beyond their sight, waiting for its next opportunity to strike.
Their time was running out. It was only a matter of time before the beast would try again.
Only a matter of time before it succeeded. The chilling reality of their isolation, the knowledge that no witcher would ride to their rescue, hung over Oakhaven like a death sentence. Despair, thick and suffocating, threatened to consume the village, extinguishing the last embers of hope. But within Gavril, a different kind of fire began to burn. He saw the fear in the eyes of the villagers, heard the tremor in their voices, and a sense of responsibility, heavy and unwelcome, settled upon his shoulders. He could not stand idly by while his community crumbled, even if that community scorned him. Waiting for a witcher was a luxury they could no longer afford. Gavril realized, with a chilling certainty, that if they were to survive, he would have to act. He would have to confront the darkness that haunted their village, armed with nothing but his knowledge and a desperate hope that it would be enough. He was no witcher, but he was not entirely without resources. His time had come. He retreated into his hut, the familiar scent of dried herbs and aged parchment, a small comfort in the face of the daunting task ahead. He delved into his grandmother's journals, not as a scholar this time, but as a man grasping for a lifeline. These were not just the ramblings of an eccentric old woman, but a meticulous record of forgotten lore, of rituals and remedies, of the weaknesses of creatures that stalked the edges of the known world. They were his inheritance, the tools he would need if he were to succeed. The journals were a chaotic tapestry of faded ink and cryptic symbols, a language that only Gavril, tutored by his grandmother from a young age, could decipher. He pored over the brittle pages, his eyes scanning the faded script, his mind racing to connect the fragments of information, searching for anything that might apply to the gloom shroud, this creature of fog and shadow. He learned of ancient rituals designed to ward off creatures of darkness, of herbs that possessed the power to dispel unnatural energies, of specific vulnerabilities that even the most powerful entities possessed. It was a daunting task, a desperate gamble, but Gavril clung to the hope that within these pages lay the key to their survival. It was his only hope. Driven by a newfound sense of purpose, Gavril began to gather the materials he needed. He ventured into the surrounding wilderness, his knowledge of the local flora guiding him to rare herbs and plants that grew only in the most secluded corners of the marsh. He collected moonflower petals, their ethereal glow rumored to hold power over creatures of darkness. He harvested the root of the black hellebore, a plant known for its potent, albeit dangerous, properties, its touch said to weaken creatures tied to the shadows. His movements, however, did not go unnoticed. The villagers, their fear heightened by the recent attack and the crushing news of their isolation, watched Gavril with growing suspicion. They saw him venturing into the very areas the gloom shroud was known to haunt, returning with strange plants and whispered incantations. They saw the intensity in his eyes, the determined set of his jaw, and they saw not a man trying to help, but a man driven by some dark, unfathomable purpose. "He walks among the shadows," they whispered, their voices laced with fear and accusation.
"He gathers his dark ingredients."
"He is consorting with the beast." The whispers, fueled by ignorance and fear, spread like a contagion, poisoning the already fragile atmosphere of the village. Gavril, once merely an object of ridicule, was now seen as a threat, a potential source of the very evil they feared. He was becoming the villain, the very thing he was trying to stop. The irony was not lost on him, but it did little to ease the growing sense of dread that settled upon him like the ever-present fog. He was alone, caught between the darkness he sought to vanquish and the fear that threatened to consume his own community. Undeterred by the rising tide of suspicion, Gavril pressed on, driven by a desperate hope that he could somehow turn the tide against the gloom shroud. He knew that direct confrontation was suicide. He was no witcher, skilled in combat and armed with silver. His strength lay in his knowledge, in his understanding of the creature's nature, and he intended to use that knowledge to his advantage. He was not trying to kill it, at least not yet. He was trying to learn. He began to put his theories to the test, not with the intention of slaying the beast, but of studying it, of understanding its weaknesses, its patterns, its limitations. He was a scholar, after all, not a warrior, and his approach was one of careful observation and meticulous experimentation. His aim was not to destroy, but to learn. Using the knowledge gleaned from his grandmother's journals, Gavril began to lay traps, not of rope and steel, but of a more subtle, esoteric nature. He wove intricate patterns of specially treated reeds and placed them in areas where the gloom shroud's presence was strongest, areas where the fog lingered with unnatural persistence. These were not traps designed to capture, but to disrupt, to subtly interfere with the creature's movements, to gauge its reactions. It was dangerous, but necessary. He scattered specially prepared mixtures of herbs and minerals along the creature's suspected paths, creating zones of power that, according to his grandmother's notes, should repel creatures of darkness. He hung charms woven from moonflower petals and raven feathers in strategic locations, their ethereal glow intended to act as a beacon, drawing the creature towards them while simultaneously disrupting its connection to the shadows. Some of these experiments yielded results, small but significant victories in the face of overwhelming odds. The woven reed patterns, when placed correctly, seemed to cause the fog to dissipate momentarily, revealing fleeting glimpses of the shadowy form that lurked within. The herbal mixtures, when properly concocted, produced a visible reaction in the creature, causing it to recoil, its movements becoming erratic and agitated. These were not just the effects of fear. These were measurable and meticulously documented reactions to the tests he was setting. He was learning. The charms, while not producing a visible effect, seemed to influence the creature's behavior, drawing it towards certain areas, revealing its preferred paths, its hunting patterns. The successes, however minor, confirmed Gavril's suspicions. It was bound by certain rules, susceptible to certain influences. It was a creature of darkness, yes, but it was not beyond understanding. He felt a sliver of hope pierce through the overwhelming darkness. However, these small victories came at a cost. The villagers, witnessing Gavril's strange activities, his nocturnal forays into the fog-shrouded wilderness, his collection of arcane materials, saw not a man striving to save them, but a man delving deeper into the very darkness they feared. The rumors that had been circulating, the whispers of his supposed connection to the gloom shroud, now intensified, fueled by what they perceived as irrefutable evidence. They were seeing what they wanted to see, what they needed to see, and he was rapidly becoming the villain. "He lays his traps not for the beast, but for us," they muttered, their voices filled with a chilling certainty. "He is trying to lure the creature closer, to feed it, to strengthen it." Some whispered that he was the one who had summoned the gloom shroud, that he was a sorcerer who had made a pact with the darkness. Others claimed that he had angered the creature, that his actions were responsible for its escalating attacks. It didn't matter what was true. It only mattered what they believed. Gavril's attempts to explain his actions, to share his findings, were met with scorn and derision. He was no longer just an outsider, a harmless eccentric. He was a pariah, a threat, a scapegoat for their fear and their helplessness. The very knowledge he sought to use to save them had become the instrument of his condemnation. He was trapped, caught between the darkness he fought and the fear that consumed his community, his efforts to help only serving to further isolate him. He was losing them, and the chilling realization settled upon him like the very fog he was studying. He was running out of time, not just to save his village, but to save himself. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface of Oakhaven finally boiled over, erupting into open hostility. A faction within the village, led by the burly fisherman, Borin, a man whose gruff exterior masked a deep-seated fear of the unknown, openly accused Gavril of being responsible for the Gloom Shroud's attacks. They saw his knowledge, his unconventional methods, his very existence, as a threat, a catalyst for the evil that plagued their village. To them, he was the cause of all their suffering. "He brought this upon us," Borin declared, his voice ringing with conviction during a hastily convened village gathering. The flickering torchlight cast long, dancing shadows, making the faces of the villagers appear grim and menacing. His dark arts, his strange rituals, they have angered the spirits of the marsh. He is the reason the Gloom Shroud hunts us. The accusation, fueled by fear and superstition, spread like wildfire through the crowd. The villagers, desperate for someone to blame, for a tangible enemy they could confront, readily embraced the narrative. Gavril, the outsider, the weaver of strange tales, the keeper of forbidden knowledge, became the perfect scapegoat. He was an easy target, a convenient repository for their collective fear and frustration. Gavril found himself facing direct opposition, his every move scrutinized, his every word twisted into further evidence of his guilt. He was met with Kola hostility, with threats of violence, with demands that he cease his dark practices and leave the village. His home, once a sanctuary, was now a target, stones thrown at his windows, his carefully crafted traps destroyed, his precious herbs trampled underfoot. He had become public enemy number one, the focus of their fear and their rage. "You are a curse upon this village," a woman spat, her eyes filled with a hatred that chilled him to the bone. "Leave us, and take your monster with you." The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. Gavril, once a tolerated eccentric, was now a hunted man, his life in danger not only from the gloom shroud, but also from his own people. He was trapped, caught between the creature he sought to understand and the villagers he was trying to save, his every attempt to help only serving to further condemn him. It was a cruel irony, and one that he was not sure he could survive. However, amidst the rising tide of fear and hostility, a small flicker of hope began to emerge. A handful of villagers, those who had observed Gavril's dedication, who had seen the subtle but undeniable results of his experiments, began to question the prevailing narrative. They saw not a sorcerer, but a man desperately trying to save them, a man who, despite the risks, continued to fight for their survival. They saw his efforts, they saw his pain, and they started to wonder if, perhaps, they had been wrong about him. Old Man Hemlock, whose prized cow had been one of the Gloom Shroud's first victims, was among the first to voice his doubts. "He was the only one who saw something different," he mumbled, his voice filled with a newfound respect. "He tried to warn us, but we were too blind to see." Ilara's mother, still grieving the loss of her daughter, also began to see Gavril in a different light. She had witnessed his meticulous efforts, his tireless pursuit of knowledge, his unwavering determination to find a way to stop the creature. "He is not one of them," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet conviction. "He is trying to help, in his own way." These few voices of dissent, though small and tentative, were a lifeline for Gavril. They were a testament to the fact that not everyone had succumbed to the Andy H fear, that some still believed in reason, in observation, in the possibility of a different kind of knowledge. It was a small victory, but in the face of overwhelming odds, it was enough to keep him going. He was not alone, not entirely, and that small glimmer of hope was enough to fuel his resolve, to push him forward, to continue his fight against the darkness, both within the village and without. He had a small group of allies now, and though they were few, they were a start. The tension in Oakhaven had reached a fever pitch, the air thick with suspicion and animosity. Gavril, once a tolerated outsider, was now viewed as a dangerous threat, his every move scrutinized, his every word twisted into further evidence of his supposed guilt. He was a prisoner in his own home, trapped between the growing hostility of the villagers and the ever-present threat of the Gloom Shroud. He was rapidly running out of time and out of options. One moonless night, as a thick fog rolled in from the marsh, blanketing the village in an eerie silence, the simmering tension finally erupted into violence. A deliberate act of sabotage, a calculated blow designed to cripple Gavril's efforts and drive him out, shattered the fragile peace. It was the final straw, the act that would force him into the very heart of the darkness he had been studying. Gavril awoke to the acrid smell of smoke and the horrifying realization that his workshop was ablaze. Flames, fueled by the dry timber and the flammable herbs he had so carefully collected, leaped towards the thatched roof, casting an infernal glow that illuminated the night. His precious supplies, his carefully prepared remedies, the fruits of weeks of painstaking work, were being consumed by the inferno. It was a devastating blow, a deliberate act of destruction meant to break him. And break him, it almost did. He barely managed to escape the burning hut, coughing and choking on the thick smoke, his eyes stinging from the heat. As he stumbled out into the night, he saw them, a group of villagers, led by Borin, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and grim satisfaction. They had come to finish what they had started, to drive him out, to rid themselves of the curse they believed he had brought upon them. "Leave this place, demon!" Borin roared, his voice hoarse with fury. "And never return!" There was no reasoning with them, no convincing them of his innocence. They were beyond reason, driven by a primal fear that had twisted their hearts and clouded their minds. Gavril, his heart heavy with despair, his lungs burning from the smoke, knew that he had no choice but to flee. To stay would mean certain death, not at the hands of the Gloom Shroud, but at the hands of his own people. They were coming for him, and he had nowhere to hide. He turned and ran, disappearing into the swirling fog, the angry shouts of the villagers echoing in his ears. He ran towards the whispering reeds, towards the very heart of the Gloom Shroud's hunting grounds, the one place where they would be hesitant to follow. It was a desperate gamble, a flight into the very jaws of the beast, but it was his only option. He was out of options. The fog enveloped him, cold and damp, muffling the sounds of pursuit, blurring the already indistinct shapes of the marsh. He was alone, truly alone, hunted by both the creature he sought to understand and the people he had tried to save. He was an outcast, a fugitive, forced into the very heart of the darkness he had been studying. He had nowhere to go. He had no one to turn to. This isolation, however, this desperate flight into the unknown, served to further solidify Gavril's resolve. Stripped of his resources, driven from his home, facing death at every turn, he was forced to confront his own fears, to rely on his instincts, on his knowledge, on the very essence of who he was. He was a survivor, and he would not give up. He would not succumb to despair. He would not let fear consume him. He would use this time, this forced exile, to his advantage. He would observe, he would learn, he would adapt. He would find a way to defeat the Gloom Shroud, not just for the sake of the village, but for his own sake, for the vindication of his knowledge, for the memory of his grandmother, for the hope of a future where knowledge was not feared, but valued. He had nothing left to lose, and in that nothingness, he found a strength he never knew he possessed. He was alone, yes, but he was not broken. He was a weaver, a scholar, a survivor, and he would find a way to weave a new destiny, a new hope, out of the threads of despair. He had to. He was their only hope. And he was his only hope. The hunt was on, and he was both the hunter and the hunted. Exiled in the heart of the whispering reeds, surrounded by the very fog that cloaked his enemy, Gavril refused to surrender to despair. Instead, he embraced his isolation, turning it into an opportunity, a crucible in which to forge a plan, a weapon to wield against the darkness. He meticulously reviewed his grandmother's notes, cross-referencing them with his own observations, his understanding of the gloom shroud growing with each passing day. The creature, he realized, was intrinsically linked to the fog, drawing strength and sustenance from its damp embrace. It was not merely a creature that used the fog, but was, in a way, an extension of it. It was a vulnerability, he understood, that could be exploited. He began to see a way. His close encounters, the terrifying moments when the gloom shroud had brushed against him, had provided him with invaluable insights. He had felt the creature's chill, its unnatural coldness, and he had seen, in those fleeting moments of clarity, the way it recoiled from the carefully prepared mixtures of herbs he had concocted. These were not merely deterrents, he now realized, but weaknesses, vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Days turned into nights as Gavril, driven by a desperate hope and fueled by a newfound resolve, devised a plan. It was a risky gambit, a desperate attempt to turn the tables on the creature, to use its own nature against it. It would require precise timing, a deep understanding of the creature's behavior, and, most importantly, the cooperation of the very villagers who had driven him out. It was a long shot, but it was all they had.
It was all he had.
Armed with his plan, a tapestry of desperate hopes and meticulous calculations, Gavril emerged from the swamp. He chose his moment carefully, appearing at the edge of the village as the first rays of dawn pierced through the dissipating fog. He was gaunt, his clothes torn and stained, his eyes burning with an intensity that was both unsettling and strangely compelling. He looked like a man who had stared into the abyss and emerged, changed but unbroken. He sought out those few who had shown him a flicker of understanding, the small group who had begun to doubt the accusations against him. Old Man Hemlock, Ilara's grieving mother, and a handful of others who had witnessed his dedication and the subtle successes of his experiments. They were his only hope, the only bridge back to the community he had been forced to abandon. They were wary at first, but something in his eyes, perhaps a hint of the trials he had faced, made them stop and listen. "I can stop the gloom shroud," Gavril announced, his voice hoarse but firm, each word carrying the weight of his conviction. "But I need your help." He presented his plan, outlining his theory about the creature's connection to the fog, its vulnerability to specific herbal compounds, and his audacious plan to lure it into a trap, to expose it to the very elements it relied upon, and, in doing so, weaken it, perhaps even dispel it. He spoke not of magic, but of natural properties, of reactions and counter-reactions, of using the creature's own nature against it. He explained it in a way they could understand, in a way that resonated with their own knowledge of the natural world. The plan was intricate, involving the coordinated efforts of the entire village. They would need to gather specific herbs, prepare them according to his precise instructions, and, most importantly, create a diversion, a lure that would draw the gloom shroud to a specific location, the village square, the heart of Oak Haven. It was a risky proposition, one that required them to place their trust in the very man they had condemned, to embrace the very methods they had feared. They listened intently, their faces etched with worry, doubt warring with a flicker of desperate hope. The villagers, even those who had initially supported him, were hesitant. Borin, his face a mask of suspicion and anger, openly challenged Gavril, accusing him once again of being in league with the beast. The argument that ensued was tense, a clash between fear and reason, between desperation and ingrained prejudice. It was a battle for the very soul of Oakhaven, a microcosm of the larger struggle between ignorance and knowledge. It was now or never. They had to choose. But Gavril, tempered by his ordeal, stood his ground. He spoke with a conviction born of desperation and hard-won knowledge, his words ringing with a truth that even his detractors found difficult to ignore. He presented the growing evidence, the subtle changes in the fog patterns, the creature's reactions to his experiments, the undeniable logic of his plan. He showed them his notes. He showed them his evidence. He laid it all bare. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to sway them. The villagers, driven by a desperate need for any glimmer of hope, began to listen, to truly listen. The memory of the boy, Finn, nearly taken by the creature, the knowledge that the Gloom Shroud's attacks were escalating, the realization that they were out of options, all these factors combined to tip the scales in Gavril's favor. They were out of time. They were out of options. It was this or nothing. Finally, driven by a mixture of desperation and a newfound respect for the man who had faced the darkness and returned, a critical mass of villagers agreed to help. They were placing their lives, their future, in the hands of the very man they had once condemned, a man who had become their unlikely savior. It was a gamble, a desperate roll of the dice, but it was the only chance they had. The decision was made.
The plan was set in motion.
They would face the darkness together, or they would perish alone. The fate of Oakhaven hung in the balance, suspended between fear and a fragile, newly forged hope. They had made their choice.
And there was no turning back.
The village of Oakhaven, usually cloaked in an oppressive silence, buzzed with a nervous energy. Under Gavril's direction, the villagers worked with a feverish intensity, their movements driven by a mixture of fear and a desperate hope that their efforts would not be in vain. They were preparing for a confrontation, not with swords and fire, but with knowledge and a carefully orchestrated plan that relied on their understanding of the very landscape they inhabited. They were turning their fear into action, their despair into determination. They gathered the rare herbs that Gavril had identified, their hands trembling as they plucked the delicate moonflower petals and carefully dug up the gnarled roots of the black hellebore. They followed his instructions to the letter, meticulously preparing the herbal mixtures, their movements precise and deliberate, their faces etched with a grim determination. The scent of the concoctions, sharp and pungent, filled the air, a stark contrast to the usual sweet, damp smell of the marsh. As the sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the villagers put the final stages of the plan into action. They created a diversion, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to lure the Gloom Shroud to the village square. They lit bonfires, not the usual small, contained fires, but large, roaring pyres that crackled and spat, sending plumes of smoke into the sky. The fires were strategically placed to create a corridor of heat and light leading directly to the square, exploiting the creature's aversion to intense heat that Gavril had observed during his exile. They were herding it, guiding it, just as Gavril instructed. The villagers then began a rhythmic chanting, an ancient incantation that Gavril had gleaned from his grandmother's journals. It was a haunting melody, full of strange cadences and unfamiliar words, a language that seemed to resonate with the very fabric of the marsh. The chant, passed down through generations, was said to possess the power to disrupt the ethereal energies that bound creatures of darkness to the mortal realm. It was a song of protection, a song of defiance, a song of hope. Gavril, standing in the center of the village square, oversaw the execution of the plan. He had woven a large, intricate tapestry, a masterpiece of his craft, depicting the creature's form as described in ancient texts. The tapestry was not merely a representation, it was a focal point, a carefully constructed web of specially treated threads, imbued with the potent herbal mixtures. It was designed to trap the gloom shroud, to bind it, to weaken its connection to the fog that was its lifeblood. It was beautiful, powerful, and terrifying all at once. As the fog rolled in, thick and heavy, the chanting grew louder, the villagers' voices rising in a desperate chorus. The bonfires roared, casting a flickering, orange glow that pushed back against the encroaching darkness. The air grew heavy, the telltale scent of decay preceding the creature's arrival. The tension was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Then it appeared. The gloom shroud emerged from the fog, drawn by the fires, by the chanting, by the carefully laid lure. It was a terrifying sight, a swirling mass of shadow and mist, its form shifting and indistinct, its eyes burning with a malevolent green light. It moved with an unnatural grace, gliding across the ground, its shadowy limbs reaching out, seeking to ensnare, to consume. It was a nightmare made real, a creature of pure darkness. As the gloom shroud entered the village square, Gavril gave the signal. The villagers, their faces pale but resolute, doused the bonfires with specially prepared herbal concoctions. The flames sputtered, then died, plunging the square into an almost darkness, broken only by the eerie glow of the moonflower petals woven into Gavril's tapestry. At the same time, they intensified their chanting, their voices reaching a fever pitch. They were pushing it, channeling it, right where they wanted it to be. The sudden darkness, the potent herbal mixtures, and the rhythmic chanting seemed to disorient the creature. It recoiled, its shadowy form flickering, its movements becoming erratic. The tapestry, infused with the power of the herbs and the ancient incantation, began to glow with an unnatural light. It was working. The trap was sprung. He had them right where he wanted them. The gloom shroud, trapped within the confines of the square, lashed out, its shadowy limbs thrashing wildly. But the tapestry held, its intricate weave binding the creature, weakening its connection to the fog. The creature's form began to dissipate, its edges fraying, its substance thinning. It was being unmade, its power waning. Gavril, his face illuminated by the eerie glow of the tapestry, stepped forward. He raised his hands, and in a voice filled with a newfound power, a power born of desperation and hard-won knowledge, he spoke the final words of the incantation, the words that would sever the creature's connection to the mortal realm. It was a gamble, but it was all they had. It had to work. With a final, ear-splitting shriek, the gloom shroud dissolved, its shadowy form dissipating into nothingness, leaving behind only the lingering scent of decay and the faint, ethereal glow of the moonflower petals. The fog, no longer sustained by the creature's presence, began to recede, revealing the star-studded sky above. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the ragged breathing of the villagers and the crackling of the dying embers of the bonfires. It was over.
They had done it!
Against all odds, they had driven back the darkness. They had survived. A profound silence descended upon Oakhaven, a silence so complete it was almost tangible. The villagers stood frozen, their eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and awe, their bodies trembling from the adrenaline that still coursed through their veins. The only sounds were the crackling of the dying embers in the fire pits and the ragged breathing of those who had moments ago been chanting with a desperate fervor. Had they done it? Had they truly driven back the darkness that had haunted their village for so long? The fog, once a thick, suffocating presence, had receded, revealing a sky dusted with 1,000,000 stars, a sight unseen in Oakhaven for weeks. The air, though still carrying the faint, lingering scent of decay, felt lighter, cleaner, as if the village itself had taken a collective sigh of relief. The oppressive weight that had settled upon them for so long seemed to have lifted, replaced by a tentative, fragile hope. The gloom shroud was gone, not destroyed, perhaps, but driven off, its connection to the village severed, its power disrupted. Whether it was wounded, weakened, or simply banished to the shadowy realm from which it had emerged, no one could say for sure. But one thing was certain, its reign of terror over Oakhaven was over, at least for now. They had faced their fear, and they had won. The immediate aftermath was a mixture of stunned silence and a slow, dawning realization of what they had accomplished. The villagers looked at each other, their faces pale in the starlight, their eyes reflecting a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and a flicker of something akin to wonder. They had stared into the face of their deepest fears, and they had emerged, battered but unbroken.
Relief washed over them in a palpable wave.
Mothers clutched their children, tears streaming down their faces. Neighbors embraced, their bodies shaking with a mixture of exhaustion and a profound sense of shared survival. The silence was gradually replaced by a low murmur, a chorus of hushed whispers, as the villagers began to process what had just happened. There were, of course, lingering doubts. Some still looked towards the edge of the village, their eyes scanning the shadows, their bodies tense, expecting the creature to reappear at any moment.
The fear that had gripped them for so long would not be easily dispelled.
It would take time for the wounds to heal, for the scars to fade. It would take time to fully trust the silence, to believe that the darkness had truly receded. However, amidst the lingering fear and uncertainty, a new sentiment began to emerge, a growing recognition of Gavril's contribution, a grudging respect for the man they had once condemned. They had witnessed, firsthand, the power of his knowledge, the effectiveness of his methods, the sheer audacity of his plan. They had seen him face the darkness, armed with nothing but his wits and his unwavering resolve, and they had seen him prevail. Borin, his face still grim, but his eyes reflecting a flicker of something akin to shame, approached Gavril. He did not apologize, not outright, but he extended a hand, a gesture of respect, a silent acknowledgement of his error. It was a start, a small step towards reconciliation, a tentative bridge across the chasm of fear and misunderstanding that had separated them. Others followed, their initial hostility replaced by a mixture of gratitude and a newfound respect. They had been wrong about him. They had allowed their fear to cloud their judgment, to turn them against the very person who had ultimately saved them. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was a necessary one. Gavril, standing amidst the remnants of his tapestry, his body weary, his spirit drained but not broken, accepted their tentative overtures of peace. He had not sought their approval, but he understood their fear, their desperation. He had seen the darkness, too, and he knew that it had the power to twist even the most well-intentioned hearts. He had saved them, yes, but he had also learned a valuable lesson about the power of fear, the importance of understanding, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. The village was safe, for now, and that was all that mattered. The scars of the past few weeks would remain, but perhaps, in time, they could heal. Perhaps, in time, they could learn to trust again, to rebuild, to forge a new future, a future where knowledge was not feared, but valued. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in a long time, there was a glimmer of hope, a fragile light in the darkness, a promise of a new dawn for Oakhaven. The days following the Gloomshroud's banishment were a period of profound change in Oakhaven. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the village for so long gradually lifted, replaced by a sense of cautious optimism. The sun seemed to shine brighter, the air felt cleaner, and the sounds of life, of children playing and villagers going about their daily routines, returned to the once silent streets. The village was slowly, tentatively, coming back to life. Healing had begun. Gavril's role within the community underwent a dramatic transformation. The suspicion and hostility that had once defined his existence began to dissipate, replaced by a newfound respect, a grudging admiration for his knowledge, his courage, and his unwavering dedication to the village's survival. He was no longer the outcast, the object of fear and ridicule. He was their unlikely savior, the man who had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. He had saved them, after all. The villagers, humbled by their near destruction and forced to confront their own prejudices, began to see Gavril in a new light. They recognized the error of their judgment, the Andy-H fear that had led them to condemn the very person who held the key to their salvation. They understood, perhaps for the first time, that different did not necessarily mean dangerous, that unconventional knowledge could be a source of strength, not a threat. Moments of reconciliation, small but significant gestures of acceptance, began to occur. Villagers who had once shunned him now sought his advice, their voices hesitant at first, but gradually gaining confidence as they realized that he was willing to share his knowledge, to help them understand the mysteries of the natural world. He was no longer met with scorn, but with open ears. Ilara's mother, her eyes still etched with grief, but now softened with a glimmer of gratitude, brought him a freshly baked loaf of bread, a simple offering that spoke volumes. Old Man Hemlock, his voice gruff, but his eyes filled with a newfound respect, asked for his help in selecting herbs for a healing poultice, acknowledging the efficacy of Gavril's knowledge, a knowledge he had once dismissed as old wives' tales. Even Borin, his face still bearing the marks of his stubborn pride, offered a nod of acknowledgement, a silent admission of his mistake. He even went as far as to offer to help repair his burnt home, an offer Gavril was hesitant to accept. These small acts of kindness, these tentative steps towards acceptance, were more valuable to Gavril than any grand gesture of gratitude. They were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the ability to learn and grow, to overcome even the most deeply ingrained prejudices. They were proof that even in the darkest of times, hope could blossom, understanding could prevail. He was no longer alone. Gavril's unconventional wisdom, once a source of fear and suspicion, began to be integrated into the daily lives of the villagers. They learned to recognize the signs of the changing seasons, the subtle shifts in the natural world that heralded danger or promised bounty. They learned to respect the power of herbs, not as magic, but as natural remedies, their properties understood and utilized for the benefit of all. They started heeding his warnings. They started to see the value in his knowledge. His tapestries, once viewed as mere decorations, were now studied for their intricate detail, their depictions of local flora and fauna recognized as a valuable record of the natural world. His knowledge of ancient lore, once dismissed as the ramblings of an eccentric, was now sought out. His insights into the behavior of animals and the properties of plants valued for their practical applications. He was teaching them, and they were, finally, learning. Gavril, though still an individualist, a man who valued his solitude, found himself increasingly drawn into the life of the village. He was no longer just the weaver, the outsider. He was a teacher, a guide, a valued member of the community. He had earned his place, not through force or coercion, but through his actions, his knowledge, his unwavering dedication to the well-being of the very people who had once cast him out. It was a profound change, a testament to the transformative power of understanding and acceptance. The village had learned a valuable, if difficult, lesson. And Gavril had finally found a place where he belonged. He was no longer just the weaver. He was Gavril, the unlikely hero, the keeper of knowledge, the protector of Oakhaven. He had a purpose, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of belonging, a sense of peace.
He was home.
The memory of the gloom shroud, the terror it had inflicted, the lives it had touched, would forever remain etched in the collective memory of Oakhaven. It was a shadow that would linger, a reminder of their vulnerability, a testament to the darkness that lurked just beyond the flickering circle of firelight. But it was also a catalyst for change, a turning point in the village's history, a story that would be passed down through generations, a cautionary tale and a testament to the power of courage, knowledge, and unity. They knew, in their hearts, that it was only a matter of time before the next threat emerged. They were under no illusions otherwise. Though the creature was gone, driven back to whatever shadowy realm from which it had emerged, there was no guarantee that it would not return. The world of the Witcher was rarely peaceful, rarely predictable. New threats, new monsters, new challenges would undoubtedly arise. The darkness, after all, was always waiting, always seeking a way in. But Oakhaven was no longer the same village it had been before the Gloomshroud's arrival. The experience had changed them, had forged them in the crucible of fear and uncertainty, had forced them to confront their own prejudices and to embrace a new way of thinking. They had learned a valuable lesson, a lesson etched in loss and paid for in fear. The importance of respecting different forms of knowledge, of challenging ingrained biases, of standing together in the face of adversity. They had learned that strength came not just from numbers, but from unity, from understanding, from a willingness to embrace the unknown. Gavril, though still a man who valued his solitude, his quiet contemplation, was now an integral part of the community. His skills, once viewed with suspicion, were now valued, his knowledge sought out, his presence a source of comfort and reassurance. He was no longer the outcast, the touched weaver who lived on the fringes of society. He was Gavril, the protector, the advisor, the keeper of knowledge that had saved them all. He had found his purpose, his place, his home. The villagers, too, had found a new appreciation for the weaver's burden, the responsibility that came with knowledge, the courage it took to stand apart, to challenge the status quo, to embrace the different. They had learned that the old ways were not always the best ways, that progress sometimes required stepping outside the familiar, embracing the unknown, and trusting in the power of knowledge, even when it came from an unexpected source. As the seasons turned and the years passed, Oakhaven thrived. The village remained a small, isolated community, nestled deep within the Pontar Delta, but it was no longer a place defined by fear and suspicion. It was a community that had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, wiser, more resilient. The villagers had learned to live with the knowledge that the world was a dangerous place, that monsters, both real and imagined, lurked just beyond their sight. But they had also learned that they were not helpless, that they had the power to protect themselves, to face their fears, to overcome even the most daunting challenges. They had faced the darkness once, and they knew they could do it again. The ending was not one of triumph, but of cautious hope, a subtle shift in perspective, a quiet understanding that the world was a complex and often dangerous place, but that even in the darkest of times, knowledge, courage, and unity could prevail. The weaver's burden, once a source of fear and misunderstanding, was now a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of the human spirit, a reminder that even the most unlikely of heroes could rise to meet the challenges of an uncertain world. They knew the peace wouldn't last. They had each other. They were not the same village that faced the gloom shroud all those weeks ago, and they would never be that village, ever again. The future was uncertain, yes, but it was also filled with a newfound sense of purpose, a quiet confidence born of experience, a resilience forged in the fires of adversity. They were ready for whatever may come. They were ready for the dawn.